Welcome to Byju's classes. Here we are back again with our weekly review of international relations, which we hope will be of great interest to all the aspirants of civil services. The most interesting development in international relations from the point of view of India last week was the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the victory of Soviet forces and Allied forces over the enemy, which is the forces of Nazism in the Second World War. This occasion was considered especially important in India because the Indian Defence Minister Rajnath Singh was making his official appearance at this great march past, great victory parade, and it was coming right in the aftermath of the hostilities between China and India in Ladakh. So it was speculated that he would in Moscow be able to get a reassurance from Putin about Russia's support to India in this standoff between China and India. Interestingly, nothing of this kind happened. The Indian Defence Minister went there. He made an official appearance. He was received very well. But Putin made a statement making it very clear that he thought that the two of Russia's neighbors were quite in a position to settle their differences through peaceful dialogue, and no specific explicit offer of support came. Of course, India was reassured that whatever it wanted in terms of arms and assistance would be expeditiously made available to it, including 400 missiles, but there it remained. The Indian Foreign Minister also had a video conference with his Chinese counterpart, but both sides stuck to their positions. They tried to reiterate their positions, throwing the blame on the other side for having violated the norms which had been agreed upon, but there it rested. But as far as Russia was concerned, this victory parade served very important purposes. It was originally scheduled for May, but then due to the coronavirus spread, it was rescheduled, and Putin was very keen to show off the military might of Russia to the rest of the world, and he succeeded admirably in doing it. There are two or three other signals which had to be conveyed at the same time. Putin has been following a policy of adventurism in Middle East, in northern tip of Africa, elsewhere, and people think that he is conveying to the West that he is not heading a state which is past its prime. He wants to reclaim the position and the glory which Soviet Union at one stage had and was treated as a superpower, enjoying more or less some parity with the United States of America. This occasion was used for another purpose. The last week was sometime when the American diplomats interacted with their Russian counterparts about the START treaty, the Strategic Arms Restriction Treaty. Now, which have been in limbo, and people have been speculating and getting really worried that if this treaty falls, then a new arms race might start between United States of America and Russia. Russia has been insisting that if these talks are to have any meaning, China should be a party to these talks. China has been finding one excuse or the other not to participate, so no much progress has been made in this direction either. One other interesting thing in the past week in Russia was that although Putin has offered certain constitutional amendments which make him effectively the president for life, he would be in a position to contest, if he wanted, 2 more terms as a president in Russia, and he would be touching close to 80 at that stage. So it would be effectively a presidency for a lifetime. And although these constitutional amendments have been passed by both houses of parliament, cleared by the constitutional court, Putin has signed to make them a law, but he still wanted to have a veneer of democracy by letting the world know that the people had also approved it. So a window of 1 week has been given to the people in Russia to put their stamp of approval on these constitutional amendments. Another interesting development in the past week was that the president of Belarus came out with a very weird allegation that his presidential campaign and his election bid was being interfered with by the Russians. Now, this is crazy because the president of Belarus has been an autocrat in power for past 26 years. He was the president of Belarus before Putin had taken over. But the fact is that he has enjoyed his position and has been in power because the Russians and Putin one step removed, have supported him. So why was this being done? Was it to convey to his people that he was asserting the sovereign independence of Belarus? But Belarus is as good as a satellite as it was in the days of the Soviet Union and Soviet Empire. So this was an interesting development. One other interesting development was that during the week it was also made known that Putin was working on a plan of a Nord 2, which is a submarine gas pipeline to Europe, which would bypass Ukraine, and the Europeans would have uninterrupted supply of Soviet gas and oil if needed, and this would free Soviet Union. From the Soviet times there has been this relationship of the gas traveling to Europe, and Putin's Russia has never changed course on that one at all. There are certain other developments. Putin is a little worried at the moment about the Americans trying to push the NATO forces away, reduce them in Germany, bring them to the Polish frontier. This would be right next door to Russia. So while all this was happening, there was another small bit of news which went almost unnoticed. The hottest day of the season, at the height of the heat wave, 39.5 degrees plus, was reported from Siberia. So people in Siberia were enjoying the rare sunshine, they were taking dips and swims in the river. But I think this is alarm bells. They should set alarm bells ringing, because if weather changes in Siberia, what it might mean in terms of polar ice caps, in terms of Arctic Circle, in terms of the climatic catastrophe which might befall Russia sooner rather than later, is all there. One rather distressing disclosure last week was about the Russian secret services announcing a bounty on the heads of American soldiers deployed in Afghanistan and asking Taliban to kill them. Now, it is a fact that about 40 American men in uniform have lost their life in the last couple of years in Afghanistan, some in the course of duty, some accidentally. One doesn't know how many of them, besides other armed forces deployed in Afghanistan battlefront, were targeted by the Taliban. Of course, the Russians have denied such charges. The Americans have taken the charges seriously, because they had created the Taliban to get rid of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. And if Putin's Russia is using the same Taliban now to create problems for American soldiers in Afghanistan, it is going to be irony dying 100 deaths. We will in coming days probably hear a lot more about this event. So while all this was happening, there were allegations against Russia, Russia using mercenaries in Libya, Russia trying to intervene in Africa, in other places. But this is what we have to review in the context of Russia. Indian Defense Minister might have come back not empty-handed, but not entirely as satisfied as he was expecting to be. But the happenings in Russia have been more than a handful. The American continents remained in a state of turmoil and instability for the whole of the past week, partly due to the unchecked spread of the coronavirus spread. The North American continents have passed more than 1 million people affected, 200,000 people have lost their lives, great traumatic impact on the economy is there. And somehow or other, what is enraging the American people is that the Trump seems to be oblivious. He marches on regardless on his re-election campaign path, thinking that he can use this to his advantage. The problem is that coronavirus is only part of the difficulties which the citizens in the United States of America are facing. They are also having to live with a president who's eccentric, who's unpredictable, and who doesn't quite seem to have the grasp of reality on the ground. He thinks that if he tries to divide the nation between the white supremacists against those who say Black Lives Matters, he would consolidate his vote bank. And unfortunately, the race rage continues, because the atrocities against people of color in America, particularly perpetrated by the police, have not reduced. Every day you come across a news item of a youngster of color being shot down in peace when he was sitting with his family, having a drink, was in a motel, or whatever it is. So this racial prejudice will not disappear overnight, but the great pressure to have police reforms, and now the American Congress has passed wide-ranging police reforms, which President Trump doesn't quite agree with. So he would like to project himself as a strong man. He would say that America is almost on the verge of anarchy, and the only person who can save America from ruin and disaster is he himself. Now, this is creating a problem in not only law and order, in the constitutional functioning of the American Constitution, about the courts. The Supreme Court gave one decision against Trump about the LGBTQ community, but the other one, which was going to keep out the immigrants, illegal immigrants, the decision came in the favor of President. So there is this odd imbalance in America at the moment. Although President Trump's ratings have been falling very fast, there is a double-digit lead which Biden has established over him, but people don't even know what would happen to the elections in November. Would there be postal ballot? Would there be social distancing? Would there be some upsetting of the program of elections? How would it affect the primaries? The American presidential election is a complicated system to begin with, but then the coronavirus makes life all the more complicated. President Trump's diplomacy in the past week has left many people stupefied. He hosted the Polish president in America. Now, the Polish president is conservative, as conservatives like Trump himself. He's an anti-LGBTQ person. He also is an autocrat, and he goes back, is a throwback to the Soviet days when East European countries were ruled by autocrats like him. Now, to host him at this time was conveying a signal to people back home, his constituents in Poland, that their president was having a support of the United States of America. Now, the interesting part is that the Polish political system is such that the president is only a nominal head. He implements the policy which the single largest party, PIS, tells him to do. But there is symbolism which is important. And also Trump came out with a statement that although he was reducing the number of NATO forces in Germany, some of them may be relocated, some of them would come home, but some of them may be relocated in Poland. Now, if this happens, this would be carrying a provocative signal to Russia that the NATO forces would be deployed right on their threshold. So I don't think that he had to do it at this particular juncture. At the same time, he also sent out an invitation and is going to host the Mexican president. Now, the Mexican president and the American president have a good personal relationship, but the two countries have been having a lot of tension. It was Trump who threatened Mexico that he would build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it, even at this moment where the wall is in the limbo. But lots of unfortunate immigrants are languishing in camps where subhuman conditions exist on the Mexican side. And there is smuggling, there is a sort of illicit trade which takes place. So these things will not disappear overnight. And Mexico is tied like Canada with trade ties to America, business process outsourcing, sunset industries having moved out there, polluting industries having moved out there. So this entanglement is going to be difficult. But Mexico is also having a law and order problem. The Mexican president is also having a serious challenge at his hands. So President Trump trying to, shall we say, interfere in the independent electoral processes of other countries. He's been accused of letting other countries interfere in the American presidential election. So this seems to fall into a pattern, but it is also reducing the credibility. More and more people in the world outside are trying to think that if President Trump is not re-elected, what would be the future of all these relationships which he is trying to build. So he also at one time blows hot about Venezuela, says the economic blockade will continue. The next day he says, I'm thinking of meeting Maduro. He finally backed out of meeting Maduro, but the point is that he has thrown Venezuela, a country very much in Latin American continent, squarely into the arms of Iran and China, and just to survive, they have been dealing with their oil illegally as a contraband with China and Iran. So they have allowed Iran and China to get a toehold in Latin America. The whole of Latin America is in the throes of a deadly pandemic, whether it is Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, El Salvador, Argentina. But the point is, Chile is particularly badly affected. And if you take the numbers of the North American continent and the South American continent, they almost come to 1/3 of all the people affected in the world. So rather than talk in terms of transnational global concerns, pandemics, climate change, how to fight a disease, there seems to be this jockeying for relative diplomatic advantage. which is going to cost America a little bit of a problem. And if we turn our attention to the northernmost tip, Canada, I think there are strains building up. There is Miss Meng, the daughter of the CEO of the Huawei company, who was arrested when she landed in Canada, and Americans wanted her extradited to United States because they thought they charged her with dealing with Iran in contravention of the blockade which America had imposed on them. She denies the charges, but then what the Chinese did, they quickly arrested 2 Canadian citizens, both coincidentally named Michael, and charged them with espionage. So their life is under threat. Earlier they were given consular access, but right now they have been, after the coronavirus threat, been put into isolation. The pressure is being built on Trudeau that he should have a swap. So Ms. Meng goes back to China and those 2 Canadians come back home. But if he does so, his relationship with America and the American president is going to be under much more severe strain than it ever has been. So this partnership in the American continent is jeopardized due to unpredictability and instability of Trump. An unexpected headache cropped up for President Trump when the International Criminal Court declared that it was going to institute an inquiry into the human rights violations on war crimes committed by American forces in Afghanistan. America has always argued that its forces deployed abroad have an immunity. And the President Trump says, I don't recognize the International Court of Criminal Justice. But unfortunately, the International Court of Criminal Justice has refused to buckle down, gone ahead with its proposed inquiry. America has retaliated by withdrawing the visas of the judges and inspectors and prosecutors and their families working out of Hague in the International Criminal Court. But I think in coming days, this would be something which President Trump would have it. He might think that this is an advantage for him. He will say that I'm mightier than the institutions which run the world. But it would take away a lot from the moral high ground which America is supposed to have as a state having manifest destiny and a right to interfere in favor of democracy and human rights in international law elsewhere in the world. The European Union continues to be confronted with a grave existential dilemma. There is a divide between the northern members of the European Union, southern members of the European Union, eastern members of the European Union, and the western members of the European Union. To cut a long story short, it is the old founding fathers, Germany and France, which stand together, the old traditional major powers in Europe, who are worried about playing a significant role in international relations. The rest don't seem to be bothered. I think even before the COVID hit the European countries, they were worried about the impact of Brexit, and they had been provoked or prompted by Britain to think whether it was advantageous to stay in the European Union or to chart out their own nationalistic interests in a different course selfishly. Now, unfortunately, there are many members of the European Union since its expansion in the first decade of the 21st century and ever since the Eurozone crisis, who have been having second thoughts about remaining in the European Union. They would like to take advantage of a customs union. They would like to take advantage of the Schengen visa. They would like to take advantage of the aid which comes their way from the richer members. But when it comes to putting in their contributions, they would much rather think in terms of their own national interest. The problem is that the smaller countries, Latvia, Baltic countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, or the East European countries like Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, these are the countries which are worried about going back to their electorate and saying that, look, this is what we have got. They are not really interested in following the principles of the European Union, the preservation of human rights, the enlargement of the scope of democracy, freedom of expression, etc. They think, the autocrats think, that their position would be upset by that. On the other hand, there are the frugal countries who believe that they have worked hard enough. Why should they contribute towards the profligate members of the European Union? So when last week a virtual video summit took place, these issues cropped up again. And I think it is the turn of Germany now for the next 2 years to be the president of the European Council, and Angela Merkel, many people say, thank God, would be now the next chairperson. And she is committed to the idea of Europe. She is one of the few people who believe that this is the last chance the European Union has to survive. If it doesn't, this supranational organization would have blown the chance of being a major actor in international relations. Now, let's look at it this way. At the peak of its power, the European Union was one of the largest economies in the world, combined economies. One of its members had a veto wielding member in the Security Council of United Nations. It had one of the technologically most sophisticated group together. Its citizens enjoyed a quality of life unparalleled elsewhere in most other countries in developed nations, and suddenly it seems to be coming apart. Part of the reason is that the Europeans complicated their life by multiplying institutions, multiplying courts, multiplying rules, procedures, regulations, trying to be very democratic, and they are genuinely concerned about what goes by the name of transnational global concerns like climate change, like human rights, like democracy, and all these were interests, if you pursued them, at one stage or the other, they clashed with the narrow national interests. So I think this is one part. The second problem was that the great stress has been put on the European Union and the countries in Europe generally by the eccentricities of President Trump. President Trump again last week came out with a bombshell that he was reducing the number of NATO troops in Europe. They would go away from Germany, and people in Europe should get used to paying for their own defense budgets. And to be fair to the Germans and the French, they have been raising their defense budgets, anticipating that the American shelter, American umbrella might not be there always. But they are quite confused that what is the point of saying the NATO forces in Germany would be reduced but would be taken away to Poland. So this divides the members of the European Union from the East European countries, which Trump seems to be wooing, to sort of rubbing the old friends like partners in NATO like Germany on the wrong side. The problem also is that there has been Angela Merkel's personal popularity remains high, but the French President Macron's popularity has had a downward slide. So he has also to worry about managing his electorate. So I think France and Germany are trying to manage as best as they can the unity of the European Union and trying to persuade the other members to help the less fortunate people. But again, the problem is Italy and Portugal, whose economy depends on tourism, are in a bit of a hurry to open up their countries. And once what is apprehended, a second wave, second surge of coronavirus takes place, all the gains of the first lockdown would be washed out. There are also small irritants. Boris Johnson continued to play a game of brinksmanship. He thinks that the closer he comes to the doomsday, the better deal he will get out of this, or he will probably take Britain without a done deal out of Brexit. What would be the impact on European Union? It seems to bother Europeans, especially like the Germans and the French, very much so. There are also other problems within the European Union. They have to worry about their economies. They have to worry about the social tensions, which even in a country like Germany, there are people who are liberal, there are people who are very compassionate to refugees, but there are people who think that the refugees have flooded Germany, they have changed their way of life, and there are, as a reaction, the revival of Nazi forces, neo-Nazis. And recently there was a bad incident where some youngsters under 18 or so got into a fracas with the police. Then a spree of looting took place, and they were taking drugs and alcohol in a park. And this seems to be putting a strain on the liberal policies of Chancellor Merkel. There have been incidents in Europe, elsewhere, in Britain for instance. There was a stabbing incident in Reading, there was a stabbing incident in Glasgow, and they were quick to say that they were not terror attacks. But even if they were terror attacks, there is always a liberal interpretation that the people who live under subhuman conditions, people who have been traumatized by civil wars at home, people who have been abused, are not quite mentally sane, and they indulge in these activities. But the net result is, as long as they are the other who belong to other religion, the color of their skin is different, they create social tensions. So Europe is going to face the same problems which Trump is facing at the moment in America, because even in Belgium, the statue of King Leopold was defaced, and there are lots of colonial heroes of the period of colonial imperialism which are going to be held to account now by not only the people of color, not only the enslaved people earlier, but also the people who are genuinely liberal and democratic and not racist in Europe. So how this is going to impact on Europe is something which European Union has to worry about. Other interesting thing is that whether the Europeans like it or not, they are being drawn in, the old colonial powers, to the struggles and strife in Africa. In Libya, Italy is drawn towards what is happening in the civil war there. The French are involved, whether they like it or not, in the sub-Saharan Africa, the Francophone Africa, and the situation in Africa is getting from bad to worse. So the United Nations peacekeeping force is barely enough to protect itself, 15,000 people. The French Legion has proved to be almost incompetent to maintain peace. So, but the French cannot just stand and watch. So this French and Italian involvement in Africa is something which again Europe has to very carefully watch about. At the same time, the European leaders, when they met in this summit, had to discuss what their response to China would be. Now, European Union at one stage was number 2 partner after America of China. It has yielded that position but to ASEAN countries now, but they still depend on China for a lot of their economic development. So there is this concern that while they are expressing their worries about human rights violations, about lack of democracy in Hong Kong, about violation of China of the norms of international law, but they can't take on China either bilaterally or as a group. China in the meantime has tried to divide the European nations by wooing the smaller nations, by trying to make them honorary members of the One Belt, One Road great scheme, and pump in economic assistance, or at least make promises of economic assistance, technological assistance, and this is the problem which Europe has to worry about. It has been the misfortune of Africa for most part of its history that people have valued its riches, its natural resources, and have had no concern for the welfare of the people who dwelt on this continent. It is a collection of 55 countries, nation states. It is rich in natural resources, but it continues to suffer. And the past week again brought out the fault lines in African society and politics which make it miserable. What Africa is heading towards is towards a long, protracted, bloody civil war in the northwestern tip of Africa in the Sahel region. We talked about how Libya, Haftar had to withdraw from his siege of Tripoli, but he hasn't given up. There have been reports last week that helped by Russian mercenaries, they occupied oil refinery, and tried to stop production there. The recognized Government of National Accord in Libya insisted that it has succeeded in regaining control of production in this oil refinery, but it's hard to believe that, because all these resources, the oil wells and the refineries, are in the eastern part of the country controlled by Haftar's forces as of this moment. Haftar had offered a ceasefire which the government in Tripoli refused, and as we discussed in past also, the Russians and the supporters of Haftar like Egypt are not going to give up easily. So this is one flashpoint which continues to be there. But much worse than this has been the state in Mali. Now the Mali is a vast country, but unfortunately it has become the hotbed of Islamic jihadists. There are several Islamic jihadist groups working in Africa: Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Nusrat al-Insaf. They keep changing their names, but they are all offshoots of Al-Qaeda at one time. And after the Islamic Caliphate suffered reverse in Syria and Iraq, they have taken shelter in Africa. Now, they also control large tracts of territory. They are ruthless in fighting. They live upon the inter-tribal feudal rivalries which have continued there for generations. They take advantage of the remoteness of where they have established their sanctuaries. They fight a brutal war. They also are helped by countries outside who are only interested in the mineral wealth of Africa, whether it is diamonds, oil, or something else. I think is worth mentioning in this context a recent case of which the people in Nigeria and Niger took to court in England a subsidiary of the Shell company and said that it had polluted so much their drinking water, their fields, it was posing a great ecological hazard, and they should be compensated for that. And the response of the company was twofold. A, they were only a holding company, and the company in Africa should have been sued in an African court, and suddenly they came out with an argument they have full faith in African judicial system, these countries which are maligned as non-democratic, autocratic, corrupt, and the court case should take place there. The second problem was even more acute. The argument proffered was it was not their fault that the pollution was created. The pollution came because the oil spills took place because insurgents wanted to illegally steal oil from the pipelines bored hole through them and could not control the pollution which resulted. So this was partly insurgents' responsibility, partly the failure of the central government. So how could you blame a multinational corporation? Now this is what you can see happening, whether it is mining, whether it is oil, and they would like to control the resources of these countries, run the governments as puppet governments, be willing parties to their corruption, but then wash their hands clean. Another news item which was interesting last week about Africa was that overnight somebody had become a millionaire. The poor miner who was digging found 2 huge many kilos worth of precious gems and sold them for $3 million and became a millionaire overnight. Now this kind of either a common man waiting for a lottery or thinking that he has to die in any case, why worry about tomorrow or day after tomorrow, is what is the major problem in Africa. There also was a news item that a small country in the northwestern tip of Africa, Senegal, had surrendered its fishing right to somebody else. So either it is carbon trading or it is acceptance of the hazardous waste created by the affluent West, which has been a plague to these African nations. But what is worse, which was shown last week, is that there is no way to stem the tide of this tribal bloodshed, the jihadi violence, the ruthless use of child soldiers and corrupt regimes. So one corrupt dictator passes away, there is an election and the election is challenged, there is a second round of election, and somebody who comes, who has once been in opposition, once he becomes the president in power, he is no better than the one whom he has succeeded. So what we have to keep in mind in Africa is that there has been a marginalization of the major actors in Africa which we thought were important, like South Africa, which was a member of the BRICS, which was a member of the Commonwealth, which was supposed to be occupying an important geopolitical situation. And the countries which were neglected, small countries, Burkina Faso, Benin, Senegal, Niger, Nigeria, Gambia, Mali, these are the countries which are becoming flashpoints in Africa. The other end is that you have spilling over of this violence from Mali to Niger to Uganda, and Uganda did something very nice last week. There was one ray of hope. It opened its border for refugees coming. It says that even if it is a risk of coronavirus spread, we can't let them starve to death on the other side of the border. So probably there is some awareness, some residual humanity in the tribal psyche still, and probably we should hope that in future there emerge some leaders who can harness this goodwill, this humanitarian goodwill, and probably have a more egalitarian polity and a society in Africa. But here again the problem is that the Chinese have tried to pump in money in a manner to control politics here by infrastructural development, by railroad development, but all that money has also subverted the ethical basis of the governance and bureaucracy. So Africa is not out of trouble. In coming days also, the dispute about the Grand Renaissance Dam between Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt is going to continue. Egypt is spreading itself thin. Egypt is trying to have a military intervention in Libya, that is the other extremity, and try to have a decisive say in the building of this dam in the Horn of Africa. So there is a revival of the pan-Arab leadership dream of Egypt. Let's see where it takes Egypt. Politics in Africa, North Africa at least, is closely tied with the politics of Middle East. And there are interesting developments there which took place there last week. The most interesting development was the rebels in Yemen taking over the control of the strategically important island of Socotra. Now Socotra is a small island, population there is a Shia population. It is supposed to be a tourist destination, it is supposed to be a biodiversity hotspot comparable to Galapagos in Latin America, but the fact remains that if it is occupied by forces hostile to the government supported by Saudi Arab, then it is going to be difficult. And there is also a ticking ecocide bomb there in Socotra. In 1980s, an oil tanker was marooned here. Just calculate from 80s to present day, this is almost 4 decades, and this tanker has rusted, junked, but it has 8 million barrels of oil there. So the people in Socotra have tried to say that give us money, we will pump this oil out, we'll sell it, it will make us self-sufficient for at least for a short while. If you don't do that, the ship has not been maintained, it is a ticking time bomb, it might be an explosion. If there is an oil spill, one doesn't know what damage to marine life, to beaches, etc. it will do. It might even block passage of other ships due to the oil slick in this area for a long time. So in the meantime, they have been bargaining, they have been blackmailing, but it has not happened. But the fact remains that at the moment, Socotra is in the control of rebels. The rebels also fired some drones and missiles at Saudi Arab oil refineries and targets. They have done it in past. At times it was said Iranians had done it. But suppose these Houthi rebels have done it. The Saudis said that they had countered them, but there have been other disturbing news items. There was a very violent explosion in the proximity of Tehran, and people did not know whether it was an accident or whether because it was very close to a site where some research for the nuclear program of Iran was being done. And the Iranian-American stalemate after Trump reneged on the trade agreement, nuclear agreement arrived at by Obama, has always been there. So this interference could have been by Israelis, it could have been subversion, it could be sabotage, it could be an accident, one doesn't know. Iran is pushed towards the corner. The more conservative, more dogmatic, more fanatical elements in the regime in Iran would become powerful, and having a deal with Iran would become almost impossible. So Iran has also to survive. Iran is the major oil producer. Oil is suffering economic embargoes and blockade, and how it will retaliate strategically is for anybody to guess. One development which has escaped attention of analysts in Middle East, West Asia in the past week is Israel's attempt to annex the territories where it had settled Israeli refugees into Israeli territory. Ever since Camp David, it has been accepted that these lands will be handed over to Palestinians who would run an autonomous government here, and in long run, this would establish a foundation for peaceful relationships with Palestinians, even if they don't become an entirely independent sovereign state. The Arab states have been cooperating with Israel on this understanding. Netanyahu seems to be tempted at this moment by the presence of Donald Trump, his friend, in the White House. If he is not re-elected, then this challenge will become much more complex for Netanyahu. Netanyahu, who had been almost painted into a corner in the past few months, has regained his confidence after the formation of a new coalition government, and he thinks that even if he has to get rid of the coalition partners, he can go back for yet another elections in Israel on the strength of this appeal that he has protected the vital national interest of Israel. The members of the EU have come out against this policy of Israel. The Americans, of course, have kept quiet, but Iranians are not going to remain silent for long, and India, which has been a traditional partner of Palestinians but has a close strategic relationship with Israel, is trying to walk a very tight rope. But I think sooner rather than later, one has to take a decision based on one's national interest as well as certain principles and norms of international relations. Now, this is one thing which is there, but it's difficult to imagine if you keep occupying territory and annexing it, there can be a durable, lasting peace in this region. The younger Palestinians might take to arms again, and a same kind of a situation is developing in Lebanon, which is facing a major economic crisis, skyrocketing inflation, unemployment, and if Israel feels that this is the right moment to do these aggressive steps, I think it is mistaken, because if even Lebanon is destabilized economically, if refugee influx is there, I think peace is going to be in a very risky proposition in this area. At almost about the same time, when the leaders of Europe were meeting in virtual space, the ASEAN leaders, representing 10 countries in Southeast Asia, were also holding a virtual summit. And this summit was considered very important by India because these countries are proximate neighbors of India. Indonesia is very close to Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore are again close enough. And then again, Cambodia and Laos traditionally are counted as falling into Indian sphere of culture historically, so for millennia. The interesting part is this, that all these countries have been worried about China's aggressive downward drive in South China Sea and further down towards Indian Ocean for quite some time. China also has a dispute on territorial waters with Philippines and Vietnam on Spratly and Paracel Islands. It has created artificial islands, continuously extended its exclusive economic zone, and cast a dark shadow on this. But at the same time, the interesting part is this, that these 10 countries in ASEAN now are the largest trading partner of China. They have pushed USA and European Union from their earlier positions. So they are number 1, EU number 2, US number 3, and then third and fourth and fifth would be Japan and South Korea. So if you keep this in mind, that all these countries are dependent for their economic welfare on China, it is difficult to imagine that they will resist the Chinese drive downwards. None of them except Vietnam and Indonesia have historical memories of greatness, a great empire, on resisting. Of course, one must hasten to add that there have been great empires in Angkor Wat, in Cambodia, etc., but nothing comparable to the imperial glory of the Chinese and the days of Eunuch Admiral Yeng Ho, who led Chinese armadas here. The armadas from India of Rajendra Chol in the Chola time went there, but the fact remains that these countries today are dependent on China for their economic welfare, and there are limits to what they can do to come out A, either in support of India, or B, resist China's naval might. Ironically, when ASEAN was founded in late 60s, it was an anti-communist get-together of nations, also mostly Malays, to take care of the Chinese, who were influential then in Vietnam and Cambodia. Now, Vietnam and Cambodia are part of first of all, the partition Vietnams are reunited. Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos, everybody is a member of the ASEAN. There are countries here which are microscopic, almost microscopic, like Brunei, but very rich because of their oil wealth. There are disputes within the Southeast Asian region, let's say in the big island of Kalimantan Uttara, North Borneo itself, the dispute between Indonesia and Malaysia, between Malaysia and Philippines, but they are much more secondary compared to what the Chinese is claiming in this region. Now the countries, take them one by one. Myanmar is a country sharing a land border with India, but it is so close to China, so much under China's shadow, and India has drifted a little away from Myanmar in recent past. So it is difficult to imagine that Aung San Suu Kyi would support the Indian claims as opposed to China when it comes to the crunch. Take the case of Malaysia. Malaysia has steadily been drifting towards a more fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. The legal system there has registered changes, and there has been an ill will against the Indian minority, which has traditionally enjoyed slightly better standard of life, better standard of education than the Bhumiputra, the sons of soil, the Malays. So the Indians were apparently in the Malay mind siding with the Chinese as long as there were coalition governments, and this drift towards the primacy of the Malay rights in Malaysia has caused some friction between almost 8 to 9% of the people of Indian origin staying there. There have been in the recent past, due to Dr. Mahathir's tough words about India changing the administrative status of Jammu and Kashmir, and he stuck by it. He came out, the government of India said that he did not interfere in the internal affairs of India, but he said, regardless, I will stand for what is right and wrong. So I think there have been reluctance on the part of Malaysia to be sensitive to Indian interests, whether it is a question of extradition of a jihadi evangelist like Dr. Zakir Naik. There have been irritants. So it is difficult to imagine that the Malaysians would also take a stance at this stage in trying to balance China in this area. They have found a route, the Malaysians have found a route to palm off their palm oil via Nepal back to India and so on. So let's see how that plays out. Indonesia is the only country which has the naval might, which has the military might, which is the expanse of land, and which also has the depth from Chinese intervention, where it probably can control the strategic Malacca Straits, the Lombok Straits, the Sunda Straits, and it also overarches over over Australia. Vietnam, we know, has fought a war in recent past with China, given China as good as they got. Also, the Vietnamese have a history of, 1,000-year-old history of asserting their nationalism vis-a-vis the Chinese domination, although they were grateful for Chinese support during their War of National Liberation against the Americans. But all that is past history. All that is water under the bridge, and half a century has almost passed. The strategic climate has totally changed. So let's not take into reckoning small countries like Brunei, but let's talk in terms of Vietnam and Indonesia, with which India probably has a coincidence of interest vis-a-vis China at the moment. But we have been talking of looking east, acting east, but not following it up with real action actually. So how soon can we capitalize it? Can we balance our soft power with the hard power? Is for us to wait and watch. We probably thought that the Philippines were very much the 51st state of America and neglected it. We thought that there was a Hispanic colony before that with which India did not share much. But there are countries like Singapore which can create probably a bit of a problem, a bit of an assistance for India in this region. Singapore is ruled by a scrupulously honest, very efficient government run by the People's Action Party. But they are an elitist party. They are accused of almost being a police state where the individual freedoms are severely restricted. And recently, when the coronavirus cases came, it was exposed that the laborers who were building up this spick and span 21st century city were basically workers from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, which were living under, according to Singapore, in much better conditions than they lived at home, but they were living in conditions of almost claustrophobic confinement where social distancing was not possible, and the largest number of coronavirus cases was among these immigrants. So you have to worry about this, the invisible labor from the Indian subcontinent contributing to the glory of these small city-states, and how much can the city-state, however efficiently it is run, play a significant role in international affairs. Singapore cannot expect to become the alternative for Hong Kong. It cannot, all the financial services cannot move overnight from Hong Kong to Singapore, nor can the shipping, nor can the air traffic. And as it is, the air traffic has been severely hit by the coronavirus. So when we look at this summit of the ASEAN virtual summit which took place last week, there are interesting contradictory takeaways. There is hope for India that some countries might take some time to take a stand, but we'll see that Indian interests and their interests coincide. India will have to be more proactive in this region, but it is not a question of 1 week. It will take a much longer time. One sensational news item which caught the eye of all the analysts the world over was from Australia. One state legislator was put under investigation by the central government on the charge that he had received money from the Chinese and tried to propagate their point of view in not only in the state legislature but also made statements in public speeches and so on. This reminds us of a case some time back when a senator had to resign along similar charges, which opens our eyes to another kind of an instrumentality of furthering its national interests which China plays. It always uses the Chinese overseas as an instrument of its foreign policy. And when one followed this news item, more sensational facts came to surface. There is a population of almost 1 million Chinese immigrants in Australia, some of them billionaires in infrastructure sector, in industries, and they have been making generous donations to both major political parties in Australia. Now the Australians of course insist that the money which they receive is from Australian citizens who are entitled to make donations to political parties like any other Australian citizen once they've been granted citizenship, and they can play a role in the politics of the nation. But where the line must be drawn is that these citizens of Australia, either naturalized or immigrants, cannot have dual loyalties. They cannot play along the line of, there can be a difference of opinion which they can express in public with the Australian governments, the ruling parties or the opposition's foreign policy line. But they cannot be blatantly towing the Chinese line which they are expected to tow because of the freebies. Both these gentlemen in politics had a history of repeated visits to China, funded by the Chinese think tanks, organizations, participation in seminars, and also there were funding of research programs in Australia, supposedly on Asia, on foreign policy, but they were thinly disguised, shall we say, academic espionage programs there. Now, all this was happening when Chinese and Indian were having this confrontation in the snowy deserts of Ladakh, and there was this discussion whenever Sino-Indian relations were being discussed in India. There also was this debate that all the sinologists in India seemed to have a very pro-China view. It was not that they were communists, but they thought that China was a civilization state. Their memories went back to Shunzhi and Lao Tse and Confucian, and then they said that they think in terms of millennia and India should respond to them as a civilization. But why should the Chinese scholars not realize that India also is a civilizational nation state? It also has historic memories which go back millennia. So it cuts both ways. So whether sinologists in America or in Europe or in Asia start suffering from localitis, tend to be more sympathetic with their subject which they study, is one part. But this part is thinly disguised interference in the political processes of a friendly country, is something which is very worrisome. Again, in case of Australia, the problem arises like ASEAN countries. A very large chunk of Australia's trade depends on Chinese imports and exports. How far can it go to alienate China is something which we'll have to wait and watch. Most of the time when we get news from Africa, it is depressing. But there are times when you get reasons to cheer. And one such news which came from Africa, from Malawi last week, was that the election commission there and the courts there set aside the verdict which had returned to office the president who had been ruling there for past one whole term. The election battle had been contested very closely. The opposition had alleged charges of large-scale corruptions, ballot box packing, use of violence, etc. And this is only the second time in the history of Africa after Kenya that the Electoral Commission and the courts have set aside a presidential election. Now, of course, the president who has lost the election is complaining against the indifference of the partiality of the Election Commission. But that besides the point. It seems that the Africans are slowly waking up to the reality and the need to have free and fair elections, to have a more equitable society in their own countries. One thing we must add before we conclude: when we conduct this survey of international relations in the week past, we tend to focus on headlines, on news items which appear to be important and having significance. We tend to overlook what in English is often said, reading between the lines. We tend to overlook areas, individuals, issues which have not been in the news, not at least on the front page, not on the edit page, not having been commented on. And we tend to overlook, say for instance in India's case, our immediate neighborhood. What is happening in Bangladesh? What is happening in Sri Lanka? And more than anything else, how is Pakistan faring? So we cannot neglect these issues or overlook them. We shall try to make amends as soon as possible and try to include them in our survey, whether they make a splash in the headlines or not. Till we meet again, goodbye.